Technology is political. That is, the means of its production, who owns those means, and the ends to which it is utilized are each and all a site of political contestation. Today, I'm joined by Joshua Dávila to discuss the political contestation over the use and the future of blockchain technologies to celebrate the release of his new book, Blockchain Radicals: How Capitalism Ruined Crypto and How to Fix It, out now on Repeater Books. Josh, welcome to the show.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me. It's really nice to be on a podcast that I've listened to a bit. I'm excited.
Yeah, thank you very much. So let's just start it off with sort of the immediate reaction I can guess sort of some people be having to even the idea of this conversation, which is when we hear the word blockchain, the typical associations we have, especially in leftist spaces, it's very much sort of an eye roll or a cringe. Many people immediately think of Sam Bankman-Fried, endless crypto flim-flams, anarcho-capitalists, swindlers hyping up scams, constant boosterism, trust the process. I mean, this is what the technology means, represents for a lot of people. I mean, I have to admit, even myself, but you actually think successfully try to portray this. Actually, it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, and it's a very habitual mode of thinking that can fall into because it separates technology. It's very reactive in a very literal sort of Nietzschean sense because it separates technology from what it can do in favor of thinking about what it represents. And this is very much a marketing term for a lot of crypto discussions too. But I just want to sort of ask you about, if we want to consider the actual operations of these technologies, both because of and indeed possibly in spite of and against sort of the capitalist means of production that produced them, what does it mean to think about blockchain technology and maybe technology generally, not in terms of simply what it represents, but what it does and what it can do?
Yeah, sure. So just on the comment about cringe, I'll say if there's anyone who cringes, I'm not sure if anyone cringes more than me on this type of stuff. It's I have to I push myself through the cringe in order to come at the points where I'm at. But yeah, so in the book, I'm very aware about kind of the current thinking about blockchain and cryptocurrencies on the left generally, because I've been doing my podcast, The Blockchain Socialist, for a bit over 3 years now. And from the get-go, kind of when I started, before there was really this really, I don't know, kind of well, I guess it was late 2020 or something like that, whenever crypto really jumped into the mainstream in a certain way with NFTs and all this stuff that everyone was talking about it at a certain point. And we obviously saw this big bubble, and there was always this kind of reaction or skepticism about it. It just got a lot stronger recently because of kind of what happened with the bubble. And I think a big part of the reason that is because crypto is portrayed in a very particular way by those who are marketing the technology, those who want to separate you from your money so that you can buy their token, take part in their product, whatever else. And so what is kind of the argument in my book, kind of the larger framework, and since, talk a lot about Deleuze, I use Deleuze's critique of representational thinking as kind of the framework for trying to come at this technology in a more, constructive way. And so the critique of representational thinking, I don't know if maybe I should explain that a little bit for people, but essentially the way that I kind of understand it, at least, and feel free to improve my understanding if you want, is this kind of tendency for people to use models of the old in order to understand the new. That we have this kind of this idea of what something is, and that's imposed on this new thing that we're trying to understand. And this is very common, I would argue, in just new technologies generally. So the example that I give is from the drum machine, which is, I take this from the YouTuber Jonas Jelka, or Cuck Philosophy on YouTube, because it was really good. But essentially the drum machine, at one point was kind of thought of as a representation of having a drummer with the drum set for your band practice, right? If your drummer couldn't show up to practice, you would buy the drum machine, you'd set up the rhythms and the beats, you'd press play, and then you can strum your guitar. And in that sort of model of thinking about the drum machine, it is the drum machine essentially a less good version than a drummer with a drum set. It's a representation. And this is arboreal thinking, of course. And then what I'm kind of arguing, or what actually happened in history, is that the drum machine kind of was used in ways that the drummer with the drum set could never play the drums. So you can think of it, so it started creating new genres of music and et cetera. And so you can think of it as like either it moved past its representation, or probably, I think, more likely that the representational way of thinking was always incorrect. It was never the right way to think about a drum machine if you fully want to understand what the drum machine is able to do in its like full capacity. And so I'm saying in the book that representational thinking is endemic to crypto. It's like all over the place. If you ever want to kind of like learn the littlest bit about the technology, kind of like the first thing you come up with is like, oh, it's money. It's like digital money. Or the narrative in Bitcoin is really that Bitcoin is digital gold. You have these ideas and concepts called smart contracts, even though they have nothing to do with the legal system as it exists for the most part. And so there are a lot of ways that we kind of use these like old mental models and impose it onto this new thing. But this is being done by and large by kind of like crypto marketing. And so they are kind of using the already existing mental models of specific types of people. So like the gold narrative, digital gold narrative, I think especially you can see that this is a way to target gold bugs, like libertarian gold bugs. Like that was the way to, they, at the time when Bitcoin first came out, a lot of gold bugs were into another project called like BitGold or something like that, where they were like holding, gold in a vault somewhere, and you just had like a digital token that was not on a blockchain or anything like that represented it. And then that was put, like it was made illegal. And so then like all these people were like looking for a place to like put their money because they wanted to hold gold somewhere. And so they all, like, good marketing tactic, they got all these people to like put money into Bitcoin. And so like this is super common in marketing. Like they do it not just in crypto, they do it like everywhere as a way to, because their goal is not to help you understand a thing, it's to sell you a thing, right? And these are two completely different goals. You don't need to understand something in order to pay for it. And so this is a huge problem in crypto. And I think what happens generally, as far as like the kind of reactive response from the left, is that a lot of these representational models that are used were like very libertarian minded. They were made in the image of like the good libertarian who, whatever, stores guns in their basement and buys gold bars of gold or something. And so there's already this association, of course, on the left of like being very allergic to that, being like knowing that this is like kind of knowing the tells of like the libertarians, because I don't know, we study so much about neoliberalism, we study about all these other things. And so it's an understandable reaction, I think. And, and my argument in the book is not that actually like all of crypto is good. It's just that we need to kind of think critically about what it does to us, because I think what it has done is it has like put this entire bucket of technological tools, which could be useful in certain contexts. But we've kind of like, there's been a kind of like wholesale rejection of it. Whenever, if we thought critically about it, maybe there are places and contexts in which that could be particularly useful. And so I think of kind of cryptocurrency and blockchains as just like one tool in our toolbox of different things that we can pull out for organizing that can be useful. And maybe we shouldn't just kind of like wholesale reject something because of the libertarian aesthetics to it.
No, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, it goes back to, I guess, a debate that happens a lot on this channel, particularly in the zero repeater streams, which is not so much a debate, but a discussion ongoing, which is, the use and abuse of cybernetics, a field for life. It represents, the representational. I think when you start to sort of look at things in terms of this, it is kind of cybernetic, but it's generally just a functionalist view of the world, or at least a functionalist view of language. When representation, as you said, just becomes like one function among many, it's just a function of standing in for this. They're saying, but they're acting like it is the function. It is essentially that the function is presented as an essence. Crypto is money. It is the coin. It was the image of the actual coin. So, it's coinage, and therefore we can debase it, and we somehow, solve coinage in relation to sovereignty. Don't worry about that. Just give us the money. And that, of course, exactly what is that? It's a representation of future wealth, but ultimately what it is please give us liquidity so we can get out of this coin as quick as possible. Jesus Christ, it's all crashing. So I think this turns towards a functionalist view of representational, a non-representational thinking, or at least seeing representation as one function among many, is the real way of breaking through this kind of immediate revulsion. I mean, as I said, before I sort of even looked at this book, I would have been like, is my wallet being inspected? And I'm like, actually, this isn't a wallet. So it's a assemblage of functions which is coordinated in such a way that it can be coordinated otherwise. I mean, it's very. It reminded me a lot of going to like conferences talking about monolith society and people being sort of afraid of cybernetics. I'm like, guys, you're trading information instead of money. It's fine. But this is like an organizational theory question, and everyone got a bit revolved. And I was like, it's just organization theory, guys. It's fine. But I mean, not to jump into the deep end too much here, but this will have to be inevitable given the relatively esoteric nature of certain kinds of discussions about sort of blockchain technology. But what is sort of the digital infrastructure of blockchain? And I guess to the most basic ones, what is a blockchain? And sort of more importantly, sort of how, in terms of the infrastructure of blockchain, how does that relate to what we typically know as the internet? And I know it's a bit of a weird question insofar as the internet is much different from the days in which these more libertarian sort of types would talk about it. They would think about it as this, digital frontier one can homestead upon, whereas now it's all platforms. Tiziana Terranova says we've gone from the homesteader to the user addict.
Yeah. I definitely that there's a whole like yeah, I have a whole lot to say about like the libertarian idea of like homesteading and like the digital stuff. But it's very super colonial and super like I've been doing especially because I come in contact with a lot of these types of people in my travels for cryptocurrency, and as well just like the people who are influential in the space include a lot of these people who are very, very obsessed with this idea of like the new frontier and being like the settlers of this new frontier, especially in the crypto world. And it kind of just like has shifted over time. Like first it was the internet generally, then it was like this and it was that. And then it was like, now it was crypto, then it was the metaverse, and it was like, and it's just constantly changing. I think it also just helps to feed kind of like this constant need for like new narratives to be pushed by venture capital, because I think by the frontier really just means like nascent market that has most potential for growth, I think is kind of what it ends up being effectively. But to your original question about what is a blockchain, so this can be quite difficult sometimes, I find, because I find that sometimes when I try to explain it, I realize people don't actually know kind of like how computers work or how the internet works in like as like a baseline, which makes it sometimes difficult. And that's not like a bad thing. Like I'm not shaming someone for that, because it's also like our educational system doesn't teach us this. We're so dependent on these technologies, but we don't ever even like get like, it's not like standard to receive a class on like how any of this stuff works. It's just kind of like this is like a magic box, magic screen that I'm looking at, and there's like magic happening in between my computer and your computer, and somehow it's working. And I don't need to know how it works for it to work, but maybe if I did know how it worked, maybe then like I would choose to do it differently. And so, so when it comes to how a blockchain works, I think I like to make the comparison between like how a normal platform works versus which uses what's called a client server type of infrastructure versus what's called a peer-to-peer network, which is something that a blockchain kind of uses, and as well like peer-to-peer file sharing services. Like, I don't know if you use Napster or LimeWire or all these other things. In a client server model, you have the server, or like the owner of the server, really. So this is Facebook, Twitter, like all these tech giants have a client server model where they own the information as like the central entity. And you, as a user, you have a client, you have the application or the website, and you are making requests to the server. You say, I want to make this post, I want to tweet this. And the server will like maybe do a little bit of some checks or something like that, and then it'll spread your message across the different clients based on whatever algorithm they're using for their feed. And so like in this type of infrastructural model, there is clearly a power relationship, right? There is the people who own the data, the tech company usually, and you who are the user making requests. And so this has, I think, this model has like, socially reproduced itself in ways to where we are kind of like in, the walled gardens, as a lot of people say, of like giant tech companies. And it's become a point to where, big tech, Google, Facebook, everyone else, like they make up some like 90% of internet traffic. Like most people who go to the internet, like right now, the image of the internet for a lot of people is Facebook or Google, or the experiences that are specific to interacting with the websites of these giant tech companies. And this has like, this is way different than like the libertarian kind of fantasies from the 90s or maybe early 2000s about like the internet being this like free and open space of like all these different things. It's become concentrated into like a few hands. And I think this has a lot to do because of this power relationship that is embedded in like the technical infrastructure. So like one of the things I try to like stress is that the way that this technical infrastructure is designed and it facilitates a particular social relationship between you and other users and like the company and everybody else. And that's embedded in there. And so a blockchain network, cryptocurrency network, uses what's called a peer-to-peer type of infrastructure at the node level. So a blockchain is essentially a bunch of computers which is basically a server is a computer, a node is a computer, a bunch of computers that interact with one another and share information about the ledger, or like what the kind of state of the cryptocurrency that's on this network is. And it does this through what's called a consensus mechanism. So kind of like they all agree based on certain already like programmatic agreed upon values or algorithms or whatever, how you want to call it. And so by using this kind of like hard, steadfast like rules of like what is and is not considered legitimate on the ledger, you can agree upon things very, very quickly. And it's constantly doing that. Information is being constantly shared amongst the nodes. So in a peer-to-peer network, what's happening is information or data can be requested, it can be received and sent between all of the different participants, versus like having to ask permission from a single kind of like holder of the data. Data is being shared amongst everyone else. And so in this case, they are holding information about the ledger or about like the current state of who has how much cryptocurrency. And so what is like particularly interesting about this is that Bitcoin, kind of the first cryptocurrency that used a blockchain, solved the double spend problem. So the double spend problem is essentially saying, how do we create a monetary system over the internet without needing a bank or a government to kind of facilitate its workings? And so Bitcoin was the first one to kind of solve this problem, and it does this through a lot of like cryptographic, like basically complicated math to kind of figure it out, and like interesting like basically capitalistic incentives, to be honest, with mining. But it worked. And so the double spend problem, just to say, is like the problem of computers being essentially copying machines. That when I make an email, I am writing it on my email client, and then when I send it to you, I'm actually making a copy. I still have the email that I sent you, and you all now also have the copy of the email that I sent you. And so now there are two emails. If I tried to do that with money, of course, that wouldn't work, right? Like if I sent you one internet dollar and I still have the internet dollar, then it makes no sense for this system. And so Bitcoin kind of solved this double spending problem. Additionally, I think important to note is that the double spend problem is not just relevant for money. It's relevant for actually quite a few things if you want to do it over the internet, including things like voting. Like voting, essentially, you also don't want someone, if you're doing this over the internet, you don't want someone to be able to double spend their vote, to vote twice when everyone else can only vote once. So it's a problem that was framed in a very monetary way, especially by libertarians. but it is relevant for many more things than just money. And we can talk about how like money and voting have like similar properties in interesting ways that like make this true, but they are of course very different. But so a blockchain basically is this peer-to-peer network where all these nodes are sharing information about the ledger, and this then separates the identity of the user from the actual platform itself. So like a blockchain is a protocol, which means that it's sort of like an automatically executed type of code and like agreed upon set of standards in which anybody can kind of take part in it if you have the resources to do so, versus a platform like Facebook or Twitter where things are controlled by the corporate entity essentially, and they have way more control over what is and is not allowed on their infrastructure. In the case of a blockchain, there is no kind of like single entity for the most part on like who gets to like make the decisions on like what is and is not allowed. These things are kind of like made well beforehand. And so this has like different technical affordances, and this is like a different social relationship that is being facilitated through this technical infrastructure. So yeah, I don't know if that's I try not to go too deep into the weeds about the technical stuff. I know a great book if you want to learn how to know more about it.
I mean, that was fantastic. I mean, I do think it's absolutely definitely hit on the idea of the platform is incredibly just the modern form of the internet social relationship of capital. Because what are platforms? Are production lines fundamentally. They are production lines where you create an account of yourself, you present yourself as an identity for the platform. And then you get into the real weeds of it, which is consuming stuff, which produces data, which is then sold on, or producing stuff, which is the stuff which fills it in between the gaps between adverts. It is fundamentally all entire production line and requires like a very stratified identification through the idea of making an account, as opposed to a decentralized network, when ultimately the point is essentially to hide identity, to evade identity. And this is why I think there's a really interesting aspect here of delinking from certain kinds of capitalist identification or capitalist control that arises when you talk about the history of crypto technology and the origins of what you describe as cypherpunk versus, of course, cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is already identified in control. It wants to kind of go through the internet, lose itself in that way. Whereas cypherpunk kind of wants to evade being captured in the first place. And I want to ask actually a bit more about the history of this infrastructure. So what were the political impetuses for it to come about in the first place? And then maybe we could talk a little bit about the idea of capture in these monetary systems. Because I think the capture element is not the most important thing, definitely is quite worth getting into, because there's, I mean, just foreshadowing here, but there's a lingering question as well with all these technologies on the basis of climate change, for example, how much power it takes to mine Bitcoin and stuff like that, which isn't, of course, the only end to which these things can be put towards. But that seems like, if anything, that could be just an effect of that capture. Because we have plenty of machines, but the social impetus, the productive impetus to make them run 24/7, 365 days a year is absolutely not tied to technology itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could definitely talk about that, about the climate change stuff. But for cypherpunk, so cypherpunk was a kind of, let's say, a small movement of cryptographers and kind of like privacy oriented people, and like basically people in, especially like as the internet was becoming, or even before the internet was really a thing, there were already people by then who argued that this is basically going to be a privacy nightmare, that the internet and computers, like, because they track all this information, every kind of like key you punch in can be recorded, like it's obvious that if this is done at a mass scale, then a lot of people will just have like, they will be constantly surveilled, especially like potentially by, I mean, their specific thing was like by governments. I think at this point we can say like private companies do it a whole lot as well. But so the movement, the term cypherpunk was actually created by a woman named Jude Milhon, who's like she was, I don't know exactly her politics, if she was a leftist per se, but she was like a part of feminist movements, and she was like one of the early big programmers back in the day. And she coined this term and was like concerned about privacy. At a certain point, some like maybe a decade or so later that she had coined the term, a bunch of other people began to take it up. Mostly a lot of men who were cryptographers and who were developers, and who were also very, very heavily influenced by Friedrich Hayek. Not that everyone part of the cypherpunk movement was like a Hayekian, but a lot of them were, and a lot of the influential ones were, of course, influenced by Hayek, and it's quite obvious. And I think this has to do because Hayek, during like the socialist calculation debate, was talking about how money, finance, prices is like an information system for kind of like, I mean, he would argue for efficient allocation of resources. Of course, I would argue that it's not a very efficient way of allocating resources, but I think there is a nugget of truth of like information being like shared within a market in order to like come to a certain conclusion or consensus about where resources go. Of course, that consensus is largely dictated by like who has the most capital. But I think this type of thing resonated well with a lot of developers, a lot of like, computer people, because he was talking about information, and what they work on is like information, and that's what they deal with. And I think like, maybe something I kind of wish like there was more information theory in a lot of more left-wing writings. But but they were also kind of concerned about the mass sort of propagation of the internet. They were very pro doing it. They wanted it to happen, but they were at the same time very worried about kind of surveillance from the state in particular. So they were generally kind of like the big, blind spot for them was the fact that like private companies do it a whole lot more, potentially, you can argue, than like the state does necessarily. But there's also like interesting stuff, and like because of that movement, a lot of very interesting cryptography was created. Like a lot of the kind of like whatever little bit of privacy you have on the internet can probably be traced to some like guy who was a cypherpunk or who was influenced by cypherpunk, and then they like created these cryptographic protocols to kind of hide to protect your identity a little bit over the internet. So yeah, I think this was kind of like it was like a reaction to cyberpunk. Cyberpunk being a kind of like, if you think of it as like this dystopian kind of like the state is surveilling everything type of world, cypherpunk is like this is like the digital guerrilla warfare type of thing, I guess. But yeah, they were, a lot of these people were involved with the development of blockchains and cryptocurrencies.
Well, I mean, so many, even the big platforms now are trying to resist even like the government's. It's quite interesting in the UK particularly, because for example WhatsApp and like, is threatening to sort of take itself out of the UK, because the UK government keeps asking for like breaking the encryptions and the like, and it's this very interesting contest between, it's like rather sort of governments wanting to break the encryptions that sort of cypherpunks have generated, and at the same time the platforms themselves either selling themselves as encrypted, or at least needing them to exist as relatively encrypted so that they can one sell them, or at least harvest what minimal data might come along on the sidelines, even stuff like selling ads. It's the constant dialectic of sort of control, or rather publication and secrecy, is something that is really kind of lost in today the internet, exactly because, as you were saying earlier, the internet and technology generally has become so mystified, not because it's harder to use, but because it's easy to use. The user interface, how do you fix thing? I fix thing because there's a little circle. I think it's called a cog. I don't know what a cog is, but if I press that on the iPad, then something should change. And if it doesn't change, I take it to the Apple Store, and they want you to do that. They don't want you to jailbreak it. They sort of using those encryptions for their own ends. And the idea of but to go something a bit more serious, obviously, what I really like in your book is how you talk about these ideas of evading surveillance can have some very practical and very sort of emancipatory, or at least availing some of the horrors of contemporary capitalism for some of the most marginalized people within it. I mean, one of the examples you give is for example, the flows of money, sort of ciphering the flows of money that goes into, for example, sex workers trying to sort of secure their income against sort of a very sort of moralizing persecution under acts like SESTA and FOSTA by banks. And then, of course, the other geopolitical aspects, for example, evading sanctions, a bit more contentious, but also stuff like WikiLeaks, which at one point did attempt to have like a cryptocurrency donation, but I don't know if it ever actually went through.
They did, yeah. They had so yeah, it was 2010, 2011, I'm forgetting now, but they had the financial blockade because of the release of the Cablegate papers, and then they had already, like right before then, had started accepting Bitcoin, and they made a killing off of it, to be honest. So like, since they were blocked from access to all their bank accounts, PayPal, everything else, they could not get the money that was donated to them, a lot of it. But they were able to access their Bitcoin, and that did allow them to kind of continue like paying for their infrastructure. And I think probably is the only reason why they're still like in existence today. And yeah, I would say, of course, like for some people, whatever, WikiLeaks is a complicated thing. Is it left? Is it right? Or whatever. I think they've done a lot of progressive things as far as like things that they've leaked, showing kind of like the war crimes that the US and its allies have committed in the Middle East. But I think it just like kind of shows that like, if you are wanting to be a type of organization that wants to fight against the institutions of capitalism, what is like one of the first things that they can do to you is like block your access to your money, because most people already rely so much on banks, like private banks and whatever else, to kind of handle their money, including left-wing organizations who want to be radical. And if you are considered an enemy of the state or whatever else, and like you've lost all your money basically right then and there. And of course, I also want to live in a world as a proper leftist, a world without money and all that stuff. But I think we have to deal with kind of like the reality of right now is that we need that in order to kind of like to deal with this contradiction of like having to live within the system while also fighting against it. And so in these types of contexts, you know, some people will say Bitcoin is money because, you know, people gave Bitcoin to WikiLeaks and then they use it to pay for things. But what I would say back is that actually Bitcoin is not money, and that's why it works. That's why it's good. The fact that it's not a part of the monetary financial system is the whole reason why, good timing, why Bitcoin is like helpful in these types of contexts, or cryptocurrency can be helpful in these types of contexts.
Yeah, so when you could expand on that idea, actually, it's not money, and that's why it works so well. Because this also occurs a lot in discussions of AI we've had on this channel. I mean, for example, we had David Bentley Hart on to talk about AI. He said, "Look, these machines are so good at thinking because they don't think, because they're not obstructed by consciousness, because ultimately their functionality exceeds that, at least in the sense of." It's not just reducible to, you know, the sort of spark of consciousness we have here, especially when it comes to money. This reduction of Bitcoin to money, or let's say of cryptocurrency technologies to money, is very much an example of, you know, Deleuze's idea of overcoding, where the unity is given as an extra part which cuts it off from anything else it can do. And so, yeah, can we go into so why is if cryptocurrency isn't money, but it's money-like, then there's this kind of a surplus value to that code, which we can, you know, has mutability and sort of actually has a use that we can think otherwise. Because, you know, as you say in sort of the introduction to the book, this isn't going to be a book about, you know, this is why cryptocurrency is inherently and essentially left and we have to sort of leap it. No, it's all got to be, we just need to sort of calm down a bit to go, you know, don't be simply optimistic or simply pessimistic, but try and take a probabilistic outlook on these things. So if cryptocurrency is just money like, what are the sort of surplus functions that allow it to escape being confined to just being money? And how does that fit in, I guess, to your wider approach to these technologies as a kind of central framing, just as we navigate these contradictions between left, right, libertarian? You know, I'm not going to say that, you know, it's beyond left and right, because when people say beyond left and right, we know they mean the right.
yeah, I've heard that many times, especially in crypto. But Yeah, like so yeah, I would definitely say that cryptocurrency is more like, the thing is, there are like thousands of cryptocurrencies and they're all like slightly different or very similar in their own types of ways. By and large, 99% of them are largely money like. Of course, the whole like study of money is like way more complex than I think people kind of realize. It's actually like a very complex phenomena. It seems simple because of the way that we interact with it. Like, you just like, either you have money or you don't, and there's like a little number in your bank account, or you like have some cash in your wallet. But like the money system has like many different layers that are like very complicated. I highly recommend the work of Brett Scott to people if they want to learn more about money from like a left wing perspective. He's very, very good. But so I took from Brett's kind of one of his pieces, kind of criticizing Bitcoin, because he, as someone who writes a lot about money, like comes to contact with like Bitcoiners who say like, oh, but Bitcoin's a perfect money. He had this really good point where he's saying that, for example, whenever you are buying something with Bitcoin, say you are on, I don't know, Silk Road, or like, I don't know, one of these type of things where you're using stuff to buy, you're buying Bitcoin, or you're buying stuff with Bitcoin. Whenever you are buying something with cryptocurrency, 99% of the time, you are not buying it like in one Bitcoin. Like, it does not cost one Bitcoin. It usually costs like $100 in Bitcoin, right? So the money is the $100. Like that's how you are measuring like this thing, commodity. And then you're using Bitcoin as kind of like a substitute for money. And because it's not like part of the monetary system, then like you don't like, it's not you're not really making a money transaction per se. You're having this imaginary idea in your head of, this is worth $10. We're using the $100 that we're putting in our head, and we're just doing a counter trade. So I'm giving you $100 worth of Bitcoin, and then I'm receiving, like the $100 worth in the thing that I'm buying. So in finance, this is called a counter trade. This is like a very known like type of financial transaction, and that's how you like, this is how we're actually subverting the monetary system, by not being a part of it. And this is good. This is great. Like, one of the problems that I have is that like, you'll see, take your Web3 like hype man on one side, and you're like, your gatekeeper critic on the other hand. Like the hype man will say, oh, crypto is money. It's the best money there is. And then the gatekeeper will say, no, it's actually not money because XYZ. Therefore, you're wrong and it's a scam. And then I'm saying, no, it's not money and it doesn't matter. It's good that it's not money. That's great. We should kind of celebrate that. Like, there are things you can do with these things because it is not money. And so that's kind of like the thing that I tried to lean into. Of course, things get a little bit more complicated when you talk about things like stable coins. And these type of things, which are like cryptocurrencies that are pegged to a certain value. For example, the most common being pegged to the US dollar. That is more like, it's like a representation of a representation of money in a certain respect. It is like several layers above kind of like the actual monetary system, which means that there are certain risks involved with that, of course. So like I think why it seems like money, or it is money like, is because cryptocurrency, you can send and receive just like you do any other like money system. And like when you send and receive it, like it exists, and it's like the same amounts that you were sending and receiving. And like, so like there are these properties that of course they line up with the similar properties as money. And so it gets like, if you only focus on these things that like line up with money, then you're like, oh, this is money. But actually there are these other things that are like not lining up, that, if you're a hype man, you'll say that's what makes it better. If you're a critic, you'll say, no, that makes it not money. When I'm trying to be like the nuance haver in the conversation, I guess.
The notion of hype really does seem to pollute any sort of discussion of these technologies, doesn't it? Because when we think about hype, I mean, of course, we have to sort of the accelerationist philosophies, which did evolve into something a little bit crypto aligned, especially with, well, I'm not going to even say his name. the idea of if we believe in it, it therefore becomes real. We can hype it into existence, and therefore the boosterism sort of becomes tied to the idea of, okay, if we just keep going for it, it will then become real. And I think people eventually sort of use that to read into technology as essentially something that is always already postponing itself insofar as it needs to keep being hyped up. And that kind of feels, it does feel absolutely restrictive, because as you said about stablecoins, it's actually not even a representation, it's a representation of representation, therefore a copy of a copy. But insofar as it is actually something that's not part of the monetary system, you're right to say that actually it's a copy of a copy, but it doesn't relate to like a real. You could even go say, even not in the gold standard era anymore, but the dollar's representation of gold, and then a representation of a stable coin being like a representation of a dollar being a representation of the political will of the central bank, or the petrodollar or something. But actually, in being a copy of a copy, then there's this third order of simulacra which actually detaches it from that real. And therefore, not to go full I guess we've already gone full Baudrillard, or at least I've gone full Baudrillard. It's that which allows it to be a sort of a free-floating signifier that's open to a new kind of capture. And I guess we want to sort of move on to this. So, you're currently working with a collective called Breadchain. And I want to ask, given that there is this kind of break from the representational function of money inherent to into these systems, how does this, function in how have you used it, and also experience other people using it for these kind of decentralized leftist ends? I mean, there's a term that comes a lot in sort of crypto spaces, which you heard before, which is the Dow, the decentralized autonomous organization, which, I mean, that's kind of the gold standard, isn't it? That's kind of, that's what we want. Unless you're going full, democratic centralism, and even then, you probably want it eventually. Decentralized, autonomous, and organized at the same time. I mean, that's kind of let's unpack that. The Tao of anarchy, as I've called it here.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, just to your point about democratic centralism, I think like an interesting maybe connection to make is that like the way that consensus works in a blockchain is essentially democratic centralism, which is like kind of ironic. But that's, that might be overcomplicating things. But so a DAO, so a decentralized autonomous organization. So in blockchain world, so not on Bitcoin or it's more complicated on Bitcoin, mostly on Ethereum and these other types of newer blockchains, you have things called smart contracts. I think I mentioned earlier. And a smart contract is basically an automated, like, executable code. It's complicated because when you think smart contracts, you think it's like it's legal in some way. It has nothing to do with the legal system. It's not even particularly necessarily smart. It's just a piece of code that someone writes that will execute because of like whatever, depending on what your if then statement is. So it's like, if something happens, then do this with my cryptocurrency. That you can think of it kind of like that. So the kind of narrative is sort of like, with Bitcoin, we were able to make money on the internet, and now with Ethereum, we can program money. So like a smart contract is like a programming language written onto a blockchain that like makes things move without necessarily someone needing to like physically grab it and move it over here. So an example of a smart contract maybe could be like, if like my flight is canceled, then give me a refund. So like there are certain things that maybe are being tracked on like whether or not my flight is canceled. And then it does this action if those criteria are met. It's kind of like how a lot of programming languages work. And so with the advent of smart contracts, people kind of thought, okay, we can basically create like, especially in the beginning, we can create basically entire corporations that are completely automated through like automatically executable code. So like the common example that was given for, before it used to be called Decentralized Autonomous Corporation, but that name shifted to Decentralized Autonomous Organization after Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, suggested the change. But I think it also kind of like tells, it gives a hint about kind of like the ideological underpinnings of kind of like the people who first came in, of course. But so their idea was like, what if we had Uber, but without the Uber company? We would have smart contracts and automated cars, and it would facilitate rides for people. at basically marginal cost. It'd be super efficient. These are libertarian guys like talking about this. And at the time I was kind of like, you're kind of describing like a cooperative in a certain respect, like in certain ways, that if this is like something that is like not owned by a central entity, it's owned by, I don't know, the drivers of the car, maybe, for instance, then you're basically talking about like a ride hailing platform, but that is owned by the workers. It's like a cooperative. Of course, like they were not thinking about it as a cooperative. They were thinking about it as like a corporation that's like proving capitalism's efficiency through this like new technology. But so there's this kind of slight complication, because there is the idea of DAOs, of what they were meant to be, and then there is like the actual reality of how people are like running their organizations that they call a DAO. So you had this kind of idealistic vision about like everything being automated type of thing. But really what's happening today now is that a lot of different types of organizations with a lot of different types of systems underneath them call themselves a DAO. And they use smart contracts to kind of facilitate usually kind of like shared resources. So they use a thing called a multi-signature wallet. So this is basically, you can think about it as a joint bank account. And then oftentimes they'll have like a token, and that token is something that you can vote on for things that are happening within the organization. And of course, depending on how you design this entire system, this token can be something that is freely available on the markets, like as if it is like a stock, and you are, speculating on the price of it. This is called token governance. It's like very simple token governance that anybody can buy the token, and you can vote on a proposal for the organization. Usually, this will be like DeFi or decentralized finance applications, in which they're voting on like, should we give rewards for people who are supplying liquidity for this token, something like that. And people will vote yes or no. If there's a quorum, then and it's yes, then it'll pass. And if that proposal is on chain, that it itself is a smart contract, that means that you have like an if all these things are met. If it says yes, then go through the proposal. If it says no, then don't go through with it. So it has this like, you can have this embedded, like unstoppable in a certain sense, execution of some type of governance action depending on the outcome of a particular event, like a vote. And so now it's sort of become, it's kind of like a lot of these people who came into DAOs, I think, came into it because, in my theory, is kind of like people want to decentralize the most centralized aspect of their life. And that essentially is their 9 to 5. Like everybody has to go to work. They have to go and do this, and they work under a corporation where it's hierarchical, and they have this boss, and they have whatever, like certain KPIs to be met. And they wanted to do something that was more decentralized. Maybe they had never heard of cooperatives before, or there were no cooperatives in their area, or whatever else. But they enter into a DAO, and then they learn about cooperatives in that process. And then they become kind of like, they start to realize, oh, cooperatives have exactly the same types of issues that DAOs have. It's because a lot of people idealize DAOs as being democratically run organizations. They are not always democratically run organizations, but some of them are. Some of them are more democratic than others. Some of them are like very plutocratic. There's a wide range in how these have kind of like, how these pieces have fallen. And so with kind of like with that, Breadchain is a project that I started kind of thinking about. I mean, mostly it came out of like this idea of like, I mean, to be honest, at the time it was like kind of like, oh, what about like BreadTube is sort of like, was at one point kind of meant to be like this reaction to right-wing content on YouTube. And so for me, building this was sort of like, what is the reaction on the left for like kind of like the right-wing ideology in the crypto space? And how do we then take advantage of these tools, and how do we build these tools for a very, very different political ends? And so it's explicitly like a cooperative called Breadchain Cooperative rather than a DAO, to be more specific about how we want to run things. Or we want to run it democratically, and members have like a democratic say in what happens. And so the idea for me here is that potentially at some point, it may be that certain people on the left will begin to realize hey, maybe we should start using this crypto stuff. Maybe there's something here and it can be helpful for certain things. Which means that if they try to start something without kind of any infrastructure being available for people on the left, they'll kind of like pop up and disappear because there will be no kind of like infrastructure to plug into. There'll be no like clear area, central place that people can come to like be a part of a greater kind of like more left-wing network, because the incentives in sort of like the larger crypto ecosystem are quite like they can be deadly, you know, like they'll people who like speculate you out of existence. And so we wanted to build this infrastructure to kind of allow a place for people who do want to build applications and whatever else that are like more explicitly left-wing to kind of join into the fold. And so one of those kind of like applications that we've built in order to like kind of explore what are the kind of like post-capitalist potentials of blockchain is called the Bread crowd staking application, in which we kind of created a digital community currency within our network, where we basically, as a user, you would give a US dollar stablecoin called DAI, and then that DAI would be forwarded to what's called a lending protocol called Aave, and that would generate interest or yield, and that yield would be given to the cooperative. But you as a user, you'll receive the community currency Bread at a 1-to-1 ratio. So then you can use that Bread as if you would use any other kind of token on Ethereum. And you can always, what's nice is that you can burn your Bread and you would receive back the same amount of DAI. So it's not a donation. You're not giving us money. You're just giving us the right to kind of like this interest being yielded. So it's kind of like meant to be a couple of things at the same time, like kind of like a local currency, the local currency system, but in a digital space. And it's also meant to be kind of like a leftist credit union of sorts. Anyways, but you're like helping fund the internal kind of ecosystem, and that way we're creating like a membrane to kind of identify where this kind of like where these post-capitalists are, and like our trying to keep our wealth and resources within our own logics rather than in the logics of kind of like speculative capital.
Well, it's definitely a project which tries to claim a certain kind of power back, which is purchasing power, which is a power which is not really thought of. Why is having control of money so important? Not because money is magical if it's money, because it has purchasing power. And therefore, the purchasing power that you can regulate centrally is then going to be a massive problem. I mean, I'm not going to. I was about to say, yeah, I can think of some uses for this, but I'm sure these things are already being used for this. You know, for example, people needing like DOI HRT, people are needing access to healthcare sort of without going through the mediations of insurance companies and extortionate sort of rates and prices. It's in the time that really I think this book is good because it sort of breaks us out of habitual cringe, not in the sense of, you know, this book is financial advice, you should go do this, and this. No, it's because we might actually need at some point, some of us more than others, to maybe delink or at least find sort of vacuoles of non-communication, to put it in like these Deleuze and Takunis terms, where actually they can't quite find us, because actually the state is the state at any point could just turn the giant surveillance machine back on, or maybe they could just keep using the one that they currently have, which is why Edward Snowden is off, you know, having a jolly with Putin, not kind of realizing actually why. Who put him there in the first place? Putin, that is. He's basically a start. Putin's basically like a Blairite, Clinton-like startup. But let's leave that for the bracket for now. I know we're always coming up to the hour, but I mean, one question actually before we get to the last one. So so other than Breadchain, if people want to get involved in this space, can they find Breadchain online or just anywhere, or do you encourage people to start up their own networks or sort of build this one? Or, you know, how can people get involved with this if their sort of curiosity has been piqued by a discussion?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can definitely join. We have plenty of work to do. So one way to kind of get involved is just to like directly message me and tell me kind of like what are ways that you want to contribute. I'm available on Twitter and like every other social media site. And as well, we have a Discord. So it's called the Crypto Leftist Discord. maybe I can give you an invite if you want to share it. But if you join the Discord, that's where we have a lot of our discussions and a lot of kind of where our updates are, and it's kind of a cozier space to talk about all this stuff. And yeah, I like, basically, I get like people who are like already working in the crypto industry or something like that, and they're kind of like, I want to actually do something a little bit better with my skills. I get that quite a lot, and they message me, and then we kind of like work together and find out what are their what their skills are and where they can maybe kind of fit in, how they can contribute to the organization. Kind of like the thing that I try to keep in mind is that like I want people to do the thing that they want to do or they feel good at, or they like the skill that they want to kind of work on. I try to identify those with them so that we can figure out how you want to work. You can also just go to our website, breadchain.xyz. So it's like our main website if you want to learn more. There's a link to the application if you want to use it. I'm also, one thing that I'm wanting to do in the coming months is I want to promote my own kind of DAO in a little bit. So I want to start a TBS DAO. So kind of right now, my thinking is that like the online left, kind of its organization is essentially owned by a couple of corporations. Like it's owned by Patreon. I also use Patreon, but Patreon is like a big part of kind of like left-wing media. It has become, or like Twitter, or like all these other like tech companies. And I think that should be kind of like challenged a little bit more. But so I would like to kind of show people what the difference is in using something like Patreon versus using something like, what I use are like subscription NFTs. So essentially, as long as you pay the subscription, then you are considered a member of the DAO, and that would give you access to like, what I would do is I would split the revenue from the subscription. Half would go to me, half would go to a shared treasury. And then that treasury would be something that you can vote on to do things with. So like, if you are a listener to the podcast, maybe someone was on, they talked about something, you have an idea about like, oh, maybe we can put this money towards this endeavor because I really liked what they were doing. Then you can like create a proposal. We can begin to like experiment and see like how we can begin to do organizing to move like the online left beyond posting. Like I'm kind of like I'm a poster. Like I think there is of course a certain danger, and also like a certain like very interesting thing about like having real economic resources that you can begin to organize around through a digital space. I think there's something very interesting about that and should be experimented on. So I'm hoping to do that kind of with my podcast in the coming months. So that might be another way if you want to like find a small space to experiment with and take part.
We'll wait all those links below again, and going beyond posting. Well, again, posting is production. Posting is commodity production. if we got paid for all the data, like even for example, just using a contactless credit card sometimes, yeah. Sometimes I use that and I'm thinking they should be paying me. I've made way more data for these people than anything I could have actually spent on it. But no, I think we'll have these. But actually, what is in the description? One final question, actually, which is I'm asking not as a gotcha because I think we can both answer this question, but it's one that hangs over the spectre of crypto discussions, which is the spectre of like, is it too late, basically, because essentially we associate with Bitcoin and we associate Bitcoin with these giant mines. I mean, at one point there was a startup which was offering, and this was actually quite good in Britain because of the insane energy prices. But essentially it was, you can have these crypto mining servers in your house and they'll heat it for you. And the sense of, this association with crypto and heats the excessive energy usage of crypto, or at least crypto as it is dominantly practiced. This question is that really just a function of the hegemonic omnipresent desire to constantly produce value that's kept it under capitalist conditions? Do you think there's kind of a sense of the energetics of crypto, which is sort of tarred it as almost like a climate change accelerationist project, is actually just a function of its capture as opposed to a function of the technology itself?
I think it is a little bit of both, but I want to kind of, an important thing to note about the whole climate change thing is what causes kind of the use of energy is the consensus mechanism of the particular blockchain. So Bitcoin uses what's called proof of work. And this is where the miners who are nodes of the network are competing in a kind of statistical probability game, a mathematical game, where you win. You are more likely to win if you use more energy into this algorithm. It's a very dumb algorithm, sort of like more energy use, more likely to win. More money you make. Of course, they have to balance that with their costs. Of course, like they cannot spend more on energy than they would in like that they're making in Bitcoin. But in general, yes, this is like it is a problem. I'm not going to like sugarcoat it. I think part of the thing of this, of kind of like what's happening right now in the Bitcoin world and in the crypto world, is that for a lot of Bitcoiners, like people who are, they call them Bitcoin maxis, like people who believe Bitcoin is like the best, it's like the best money, it's the only thing that we need. And there are people who believe that like all other cryptocurrency is like stupid, ridiculous, shouldn't exist. We should only have Bitcoin. These types of people will say that this is a feature and not a bug, and that this is how it should be. And they have like a very incorrect view about, they'll say that Bitcoin is backed by energy, but the thing is you cannot extract the energy that is behind Bitcoin in the way that you can extract gold if it's like backing a monetary system. So there's a disconnect there. But that is a problem. Bitcoin right now is basically the only cryptocurrency, like big one, that uses proof of work anymore. So we had Ethereum, which is where, of course, as well, you had all the NFTs. That's where you have all the smart contract work, decentralized finance. Ethereum in the past year shifted from proof of work to proof of stake, which is a different type of consensus mechanism, which uses like 99.7% less energy. Like this is calculated by a lot of people, including like the digiconomist guy who is like very anti-crypto and like, because of climate change stuff, he even admitted that. But so proof of stake is a different type of consensus mechanism where instead of like the amount of energy you're putting in, it's really the amount of stake that you're willing to put down as collateral as part of the consensus mechanism. So instead of being this competition of like who can use more energy, it's this probabilistic kind of like provably random game of like the more stake you have, the more likely you are to win. Of course, this still has the dynamics of like the more money you have, the easier it is to make money. But this is like this is inherent to capitalism. Like the whole reason it works is because it aligns with the incentives of capitalism, and that's something to interrogate as well. That that'll be a whole other discussion. But so now we're at a point where it's basically only Bitcoin that's doing this, and Ethereum. Like to be like, I think I cannot stress enough. Like if you are aware of like the details of how much work and like technical work and like innovation it took to move from proof of work to proof of stake as the entire system was still running is actually quite incredible. It actually is like a huge like technological feat. I'm saying this as someone who is like a technical project manager for different tech projects before. Like it is huge and it is like very complex, and they pulled it off without a hitch, for most part without a hitch, and that's pretty incredible. And that was something that was known from the beginning about Ethereum, is that they were going to move to proof of stake. That was always the plan, because there's always this acknowledgement that proof of work is only going to get worse. So the question is, will Bitcoin ever move to a different consensus mechanism? My feeling is probably not. Like it's very difficult to convince these people of that. They are like I don't know, very stuck in their ways. There are people who try to change it, but they're not going to. I don't think it's going to succeed. So that is a problem. But I think the problem is, like, when we're talking about the question of climate change, there are like so many different factors involved in what is contributed to climate change that to blame Bitcoin itself, like in it abstractly, is very not useful. It's not going to help anything. Like if, of course, we were using if we had way more like renewable energy already available, then it wouldn't be like as big of an issue. But we don't, because of like decades of mismanagement and like lack of will to kind of create this change, and the power of the oil and gas lobby and all these things. So I think it's it's just not particularly useful to blame it abstractly. Of course, if you have like Bitcoin mines in your town and they're like extracting all the energy out of your town, then like, of course, like that's bad. Like you're being affected by that materially and like potentially driving up your costs. So I totally understand that. So yeah, I think it is a bit of a death cult in many respects, Bitcoin. And I think the death cult, it exists though, because it's like, we're not like, the system has not provided anything else more useful for these types of people to do, you know? And it's a mass systemic failure that's kind of like causing this.
No, it reminds me a little bit of this. There's a piece. So the publisher Urbanomic did a bunch of NFTs once as like an art project. It's the only project of that sort of ever sort of resonated with me, because it was about the work of George Bataille. And because it was acknowledging the expenditures of energy that were going into this. And there was an accompanying essay called, it was basically these pictures of like saplings. It was by Maya over at Urbanomic. It was called NFTs for Saps. And there was an essay about, well, this is a sort of a deliberate expenditure, it's like, of energy, a mass expenditure, sort of putting things back out into the general economy is pure waste. And it was basically meant to say, okay, hell, what are we doing now? We are doing a podcast. We are using a lot of energy on this podcast. Is it the most utile? Reducing everything's that utility is itself a political question. And I think absolutely, to see the question of Bitcoin's hegemony and the energy usage as isomorphic with not necessarily the same intensity or same extent, but in terms of form with the oil and gas lobbies. And that, a really good way to put it. And it is a problem going forward with these technologies, but that's why it's a problem rather than a sort of a full-on condemnation. And why this book is so sort of fascinating in terms of how it navigates these contradictions about sort of going, we need this in a sense of this is the one weird trick, And so it's whenever it comes to the hour now. But say, well, thank you for writing it. Thank you for coming on the show. And folks, it is called Blockchain Radicals. It is out now on Repeater Books. Josh, where can people find you? We'll put all the links to with Breadchain. Yep. How Capitalism Ring Crypto and how to fix it. Goodbye. Yeah. Go buy it. That is the only financial advice in this podcast. Go buy the book. That's the only financial advice. Everything else is not financial advice. All right. I'll catch you folks later. Cheers for logging on.
Thanks so much.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zero Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zero has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.